Russia built the city of Severodvinsk to outlast the apocalypse. It sits on the White Sea in the far north, roughly 1,500 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian-held ground, wrapped in cold water, empty tundra, and a Cold War air defense network that was designed to guard the single most valuable industrial site in the entire Russian military machine. The shipyards there build Russia's nuclear submarines. There's exactly one place on Earth that does that job for Moscow, and this is it. For most of the last 80 years, this city was treated as sacred ground. It was closed to foreigners, closed to most Russians, ringed with checkpoints, and layered with air defense batteries, whose only purpose was to make sure that nothing, not a bomber, not a cruise missile, not a stray reconnaissance aircraft, ever got close enough to see what was happening on the slipways. That is the city as it was designed. That is not quite the city as it exists today. New satellite analysis published by the Barents Observer and cross-checked by several other outlets tracking the war shows that a significant portion of the long-range air defense protecting Severodvinsk has simply vanished, not been upgraded, not been consolidated into a smaller, more efficient footprint. Vanished. At least 24 S-300 and S-400 systems, mobile long-range surface-to-air missile launchers that once sat in fixed, purpose-built positions around the city, are gone from the satellite record. The radars that once guided their missiles are gone. The support vehicles that once served them are gone. The ammunition storage containers that once sat beside them are gone. Where fields of concrete hardstands once held rows of launch vehicles with their missile tubes raised toward the sky, there is now, in the most recent imagery from the summer of 2026, simply empty ground. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand what Severodvinsk actually is. It is not just another provincial Russian city with a factory in it. It is home to two shipyards, Sevmash and Zvezdochka, standing side by side on the same stretch of coastline, and between them they form the entire backbone of Russia's underwater nuclear deterrent. Sevmash is the only shipyard in the whole of Russia capable of building a new nuclear-powered submarine from the keel up. Every Borai-class ballistic missile submarine that has ever entered service with the Russian Navy, the boats that carry a meaningful share of Russia's second strike nuclear capability, was built there. Every Yasen-class attack submarine, the boats NATO planners worry about most when they think about the North Atlantic in wartime, came out of Sevmash. If that yard were ever seriously damaged, Russia would not simply lose a few vessels under construction. It would lose its only pipeline for producing that entire category of weapon system for years, possibly for a generation. Next door, Zvezdochka does the equally essential but less glamorous work of repair, refit, and modernization, taking older submarines and keeping them combat capable, extending the life of a fleet that Russia can no longer replace quickly or cheaply. Together, these two yards are, in a very real sense, irreplaceable. There is no backup. There is no shadow factory somewhere else in Russia that can pick up the slack if Severodvinsk goes offline. Given that, it should come as no surprise that the Soviet Union, and later the Russian Federation, built an extraordinarily dense air defense shield around the city. For decades, that shield was the responsibility of a single unit, the 1528th Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiment, based in and around Severodvinsk, under what is now the Leningrad Military District. This regiment's entire reason for existing was to make sure that the airspace over Sevmash and Zvezdochka stayed closed. It operated multiple battalions of S-300 systems, later reinforced and in places replaced by the newer S-400, positioned at several fixed sites chosen specifically for their overlapping fields of fire around the shipyards and the surrounding approaches from the sea and the air. Two of those positions, in particular, come up again and again in the recent satellite analysis. A site on Imagery Island, essentially an urban peninsula that sits right against the Sevmash complex itself, and a second, larger position on high ground called Mironova Gora, roughly 12 kilometers outside the city, chosen because elevated terrain gives radar systems a longer, cleaner line of sight over a much wider area. Look at what the satellite record shows at Imagery Island. As recently as 2024, imagery documented what analysts describe as two full S-300 batteries there, complete with their launch vehicles, their target acquisition and illumination radars, the vehicles used to guide missiles onto incoming targets, and the associated ammunition storage. Some assessments count as many as 14 individual launcher and support vehicles across the forward and rear portions of that position at various points in the historical record. By 2025, that equipment starts disappearing from the imagery. By the most recent images available from the summer of 2026, the position is described essentially as empty, not repositioned within the site, not swapped out for a newer type of launcher, empty. The radar vans that once sat on raised platforms to give them a clear line of sight over the White Sea are gone. The concrete pads, where transporter erector launchers once stood loaded with ready missiles, show nothing but bare ground and the faint outlines of where vehicles used to sit. The story at Mironova Gora is nearly identical and in some ways more striking because that position was larger. As of 2024, satellite imagery documented roughly 8 S-300 and in some assessments S-300 and S-400 launchers on that hilltop, along with the radar systems needed to actually operate them. This was a serious, hardened, permanent-looking military installation, not some improvised forward deployment. It had been there in one form or another for decades. By 2025 and into 2026, it too shows up in the imagery as essentially cleared out. The launchers are gone. The radars are gone. What is left behind is largely just the scarred earth and access roads that give away where a serious military position used to be. There is a detail here that gives this story its emotional center, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it turns an abstract satellite analysis into something much more human. Barely 500 meters from the now empty Mironova Gora position sits a cemetery in Severodvinsk. In late April of 2024, a coffin arrived there carrying the body of Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Spiridonov, a 51-year-old career air defense officer from the city, believed to have served as a battalion commander operating the S-400 system, quite possibly at that very hillside position before the war pulled his unit away from home. Spiridonov was killed in occupied Crimea on the same day that Russian officials confirmed Ukrainian forces had struck air defense positions on the peninsula. Moscow acknowledged the strike publicly. It did not report military casualties at the time. But local channels back in Severodvinsk did report a death and a funeral, and the return of a hometown officer from the 1528th Regiment, laid to rest just a few hundred meters from the empty hilltop, where his unit's launchers once stood watch over the submarine yards. Taken on its own, one officer's death proves very little. Officers from air defense units serve in many roles, and the war in Ukraine has claimed personnel from across the Russian military, including units nominally stationed thousands of kilometers from the front. But taken together with the satellite record, Spiridonov's death becomes something closer to a data point, a small human confirmation of a much larger, colder pattern. If a battalion commander from Severodvinsk's home air defense regiment was operating an S-400 system in occupied Crimea and was killed there in a strike that Ukrainian forces themselves specifically targeted at air defense positions, then it is a reasonable and fairly conservative inference that his unit, or at least its equipment, had been pulled out of the Arctic and sent south into the war, long before the satellites confirmed the empty hardstands back home. He came home in a coffin to bury him a few hundred meters from where his launchers used to stand. That is about as close as open source intelligence usually gets to closing the loop between a satellite image of an empty field and the human chain of decisions that emptied it. So why would Russia do this? Why would a state that spent decades building a dedicated, purpose-built air defense shield around its only nuclear submarine construction yard choose to strip that shield down to almost nothing in the middle of a war, no less? The answer, according to the analysts who have been tracking this pattern, comes down to a brutally simple math problem. Russia is running out of long-range interceptor missiles faster than its factories can replace them, and Ukraine's long-range drone campaign has spent the better part of the last 2 years forcing Moscow to defend an ever-expanding list of targets with a finite, shrinking pool of launchers. Refineries have burned, ammunition depots have burned, airfields deep inside Russian territory, places that were once considered untouchable simply by virtue of distance, have been hit again and again. Every one of those strikes creates political pressure inside the Russian government to put visible air defense assets somewhere the cameras and the telegram channels can see them, protecting the capital, protecting the refineries that keep the economy limping along, protecting the front line itself in occupied Ukraine, where Ukrainian forces have specifically and repeatedly targeted Russian S-300 and S-400 batteries, because those systems double as more than just air defense weapons. In a pinch, and Russia has used them this way more than once, S-300 and S-400 missiles can also be fired in a surface-to-surface mode against ground targets, which makes them doubly valuable and doubly likely to get expended and destroyed in an active war zone. Faced with that kind of pressure and with domestic missile production apparently unable to keep pace with the rate of loss, Russian planners have made a series of quiet, unannounced choices about who gets protected and who does not. And the pattern in those choices is not subtle once you start comparing it across regions. Time and again, the systems that get pulled are the ones sitting in places considered, at least until recently, safely out of range. The systems that stay, or that get reinforced, are the ones sitting closer to where the war is actually being fought, or closer to targets that have already been hit, or close to Moscow itself. This is not the first time this exact pattern has shown up. In late 2023, investigators working with the open-source collective Bellingcat documented Russia quietly moving S-400 batteries out of the Kaliningrad exclave. That small, heavily militarized sliver of Russian territory wedged between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic coast, and redeploying them toward Rostov-on-Don and other positions closer to the front line and to occupied Crimea. Kaliningrad had spent years being treated by NATO planners as one of the most densely defended pieces of real estate on the planet, a forward bastion bristling with air defense and anti-ship systems specifically meant to deter any NATO move into the Baltic. And yet, when the war in Ukraine started consuming missiles faster than Russia could replace them, even Kaliningrad's shield thinned out. The same thing has now been documented happening much further north, in Russia's Arctic. Satellite imagery, sourced by outlets tracking the Russian military, shows that a missile base near the Rogachevo airfield on the remote Novaya Zemlya archipelago, a site that had held multiple launch vehicles and radar systems in place since at least 2015, has in recent imagery had most of its air defense assets removed as well. Rogachevo is about as far from Ukraine, geographically and psychologically, as Russian territory gets. It is an Arctic airfield, historically associated with Russia's nuclear testing history and its northern strategic aviation. If the shield is thinning out there too, it strongly suggests this is not an isolated, one-off decision about Severodvinsk specifically. It looks like a broader doctrine shift, a recalculation of risk across the entire Russian military map, in which the far north, once treated as inherently safe by virtue of distance and hostile terrain, is being deliberately deprioritized in favor of regions Moscow now judges to be under more immediate threat. And that recalculation appears to go beyond just where units are pulled from. It also shows up in where those units, or their replacements, are showing up instead. Satellite imagery has captured what looks like a striking mirror image of the story in Severodvinsk, empty fields near the Saratov oil refinery in southwestern Russia, once genuinely empty as recently as a couple of years ago, that by mid-25 had filled in with multiple missile launch vehicles, their tubes raised and ready. That refinery has been struck repeatedly by Ukrainian drones since early 2025, which makes the appearance of new air defense there a fairly logical, if reactive, response. Closer to home in Moscow itself, reports have surfaced of military crews moving into public parkland in the capital in recent weeks, specifically to host S-400 batteries. A strong signal that even the seat of Russian government feels the need for additional protection that it apparently did not feel it needed before. Put simply, Russia appears to be playing a very large, very high-stakes game of whack-a-mole with a finite and shrinking supply of long-range air defense systems, moving them from wherever the immediate political or military pressure is lowest to wherever it has just spiked. Independent open-source research cited alongside these reports puts some rough numbers on the scale of this shuffling. Before the war, Russia's S-300 and S-400 force is estimated to have comprised somewhere in the neighborhood of 116 battalions, operating roughly 927 individual transporter erector launcher vehicles, spread across the country in a layered, defense-in-depth posture that was specifically designed to create what military planners call an anti-access area denial bubble, a zone of airspace so heavily defended that an adversary's aircraft and missiles simply could not operate inside it without unacceptable losses. That bubble was one of the pillars of what is sometimes called Russia's bastion strategy, and the idea of wrapping its most strategically vital assets, its nuclear forces chief among them, in overlapping, redundant layers of air defense so dense that no conventional attack could realistically punch through. According to the research now circulating among analysts tracking this shift, something like 580 of those original transporter erector launchers, equivalent to roughly 72 full battalions, have been moved away from their permanent pre-war positions. Many of those moves, notably, originated from the eastern, central, and Leningrad military districts, which is to say, from exactly the kind of far-flung, historically low-threat regions that Severodvinsk and Rogachevo both sit inside. Analysts studying this pattern describe it in fairly stark terms. This is not simply a redeployment of forces from one map coordinate to another. It represents, in their assessment, a real and significant erosion of the multi-layered air defense structure that Russia spent decades building. The anti-access, area denial bubble that was meant to provide strategic deterrence against NATO in a broader confrontation has visibly shrunk. The surface-to-air component of the bastion strategy, the doctrine built specifically around protecting Russia's most sensitive strategic assets, has been measurably weakened. And that weakening is not happening because of some deliberate, considered strategic redesign. It is happening because the war in Ukraine is forcing improvisation, forcing Russian commanders to solve today's immediate crisis, whatever refinery or airfield or city just got hit this week, at the expense of tomorrow's theoretical, longer-term threat. That distinction matters enormously, and it's worth pausing on, because it goes to how outside analysts are reading Russian intentions right now. A Norwegian defense researcher who studies Russian naval operations in the high north and the broader war has described this as evidence of a growing mismatch between the sheer number of targets Russia now feels it must protect and the actual number of launchers, interceptor missiles, and trained crews it has available to protect them with. That is not a description of a country confidently managing its resources according to a coherent long-term plan. It is a description of a country triaging, making urgent, reactive choices about which fires to fight first, and simply accepting that other fires, for now, will have to go unattended. A separate assessment from a professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies frames the implication slightly differently, but arrives at a related conclusion. The fact that Russia is willing to leave its far northern military and industrial infrastructure, this thinly defended, suggests that Moscow does not currently anticipate any imminent escalation or attack in that specific region. In other words, Russian planners appear to be making a calculated bet that whatever risk they are accepting by stripping Severodvinsk's air defenses is a risk worth taking, because the immediate active threats sitting closer to the war in Ukraine are simply more pressing than the theoretical, longer-term threat of someone eventually deciding to hit a shipyard 1,500 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian position. And that brings us to the single most interesting and, in some ways, most darkly ironic piece of this entire story. Ukraine has never fired a shot at the Sevmash or Zvezdoshka shipyards. Not a drone, not a missile, not so much as a reported attempt. There is no evidence in any of the reporting or the satellite analysis that Kiev has targeted or is currently planning to target Severodvinsk specifically. And yet, Russia has already, apparently voluntarily, stripped away a large share of the air defense protecting the one facility in the entire country capable of building its nuclear submarines. Ukraine did not have to send a single drone that far north to achieve this outcome. It simply had to keep doing what it has been doing everywhere else, hitting refineries, hitting depots, hitting airfields, hitting air defense positions in occupied Crimea again and again at a pace and a geographic spread that Russia's finite stockpile of interceptor missiles and launcher vehicles simply cannot keep up with. The pressure applied everywhere else in the country has produced a vacuum specifically over Severodvinsk, not because anyone aimed for that vacuum, but because something, somewhere, had to give, and the far north, treated for generations as untouchable by virtue of sheer distance, turned out to be the thing that gave. There's a phrase worth sitting with here, that this might be the more impressive achievement, because striking a target directly requires overcoming that target's specific defenses, its specific radar coverage, its specific interceptor missiles in a single decisive engagement. Forcing an adversary to unilaterally weaken those defenses without ever having to engage them directly is, in some sense, a more efficient use of scarce resources. It is attrition warfare conducted almost entirely through psychological and logistical pressure rather than direct kinetic contact. Every drone Ukraine sends at a refinery in Saratov, every strike on an ammunition depot near the front, every hit on an air defense battery in occupied Crimea adds another data point to the pile of evidence Russian commanders have to weigh when they decide where their next available S-300 or S-400 battalion needs to go. And overwhelmingly, the evidence suggests, those commanders keep deciding that battalion needs to go somewhere other than Severodvinsk. Whether this represents a genuine, exploitable vulnerability or simply an acceptable, calculated risk on Russia's part depends heavily on things that are much harder to observe from a satellite than an empty concrete hardstand. It depends on what other layers of defense, if any, remain in place around the shipyards that satellite imagery of long-range S-300 and S-400 positions simply would not capture. Shorter-range systems like the Pantsir, which are typically deployed closer to the specific facility they are protecting rather than at fixed hilltop positions kilometers away. Electronic warfare capabilities designed to jam or spoof drones rather than physically shoot them down, and conventional air defense assets that might not show up clearly in the kind of open-source satellite analysis being used here. Some assessments of the current situation note that what remains around Severodvinsk after this drawdown appears to be, at least for now, a fairly limited set of shorter-range systems, a meaningful downgrade from the dense, overlapping long-range coverage that used to exist there, even if it is not literally nothing. It's also worth being honest about what this kind of satellite-based open-source analysis can and cannot tell us with certainty. It can tell us, with a fairly high degree of confidence, that specific pieces of specific hardware that used to be visible at specific coordinates are no longer visible there. It can tell us the rough timeline over which that equipment disappeared. It cannot tell us with total certainty where that equipment went, whether it was fully redeployed and remains combat effective somewhere else, whether some of it was destroyed and simply never replaced, or whether some of it is sitting in reserve, in a depot, waiting to be reactivated the moment Moscow judges the northern threat picture has changed. The circumstantial evidence, The death of an officer from Severodvinsk's home regiment in a Ukrainian strike specifically targeting air defense positions in Crimea points fairly strongly toward at least some of this equipment having gone south into the active war rather than into storage. But circumstantial evidence is still circumstantial, and any responsible reading of this story has to hold that uncertainty rather than paper over it. What is much less uncertain is the broader trend this fits into, because it is not an isolated data point. It sits alongside the earlier, well-documented movement of S-400 batteries out of Kaliningrad, alongside the apparent stripping of air defenses at Rogachevo in the high Arctic, alongside independent research estimating that something like 72 battalions worth of Russia's pre-war S-300 and S-400 force has been pulled from its original positions. Taken together, this paints a picture of a Russian air defense network under real, sustained structural strain, a network that was designed for a different kind of war, a shorter war, or at least a war fought on Russia's own terms and timeline, and that is now being stretched, reshuffled, and in places quietly hollowed out to cope with the actual war Russia finds itself fighting, a war in which its own territory, far beyond the traditional front line, has become a target in ways that simply were not anticipated when these Cold War-era defensive positions were first built. For the people who actually live in Severodvinsk, this story probably registers less as a strategic abstraction and more as a lived, quiet unease. This is a city that was built, quite literally, around the idea of being defended, a closed military town where the presence of those launcher positions on Yagri Island and up on Mironova Gora was simply part of the landscape, as permanent seeming as the shipyards themselves. Watching that shield thin out, watching your hometown regiment's equipment disappear from the hillside a few hundred meters from where you buried a neighbor's son, is the kind of change that doesn't need a headline to be felt. It is felt in the empty patch of ground where the radar used to be. And for military planners in Moscow, this almost certainly is not the last chapter of this particular story. If Ukraine's long-range drone campaign continues at anything like its current pace and geographic reach, and if Russian domestic missile and launcher production continues to lag behind the rate at which existing systems are being expended or redeployed, the same brutal math that emptied out Severodvinsk's hillside will keep applying pressure elsewhere. More positions, in more supposedly safe regions, will likely thin out in the coming months as Moscow continues triaging a growing list of targets against a shrinking pool of available defenses. Whether that eventually forces a genuine strategic reckoning inside the Russian defense establishment, a real reassessment of how thinly a modern air defense network can be stretched before it stops functioning as a coherent shield at all, or whether Russia simply continues absorbing this kind of risk indefinitely, betting that the parts of the country it leaves undefended will keep going unattacked, is one of the more consequential open questions of this stage of the war. What the satellite record over Severodvinsk shows, for now, is not an attack. It is the shadow an attack elsewhere casts over a place that was never touched at all. An empty hillside, 12 kilometers from a submarine yard. A vacant strip of concrete on an island where launch vehicles used to stand. A grave 500 meters away, belonging to a man who may well have once commanded the missiles that used to be there. None of it required a single Ukrainian drone to cross 1,500 kilometers of Russian airspace. It only required Ukraine to keep doing, everywhere else, exactly what it has already been doing, and to let the arithmetic of a finite, dwindling stockpile of Russian interceptor missiles do the rest of the work on its own. Step back from Severodvinsk itself for a moment, and the story starts to look less like a single quirky data point and more like a stress test of an entire theory of deterrence that Russia, and the Soviet Union before it, spent the better part of a century building. The whole logic of the Bastion concept rested on a fairly simple premise: that Russia's most valuable strategic assets, its ballistic missile submarines above all, needed a protected sanctuary, a stretch of sea and coastline, so thoroughly defended in every dimension, air, surface, and subsurface, that no adversary could credibly threaten it, even in a full-scale confrontation with NATO. The White Sea and the surrounding Arctic coastline were chosen for this role for good reason. They are remote. They are difficult to approach. Historically, any hostile aircraft or missile trying to reach Severodvinsk would have had to cross enormous distances of hostile airspace, past layered air defenses, past interceptor aircraft, past early warning radar chains built specifically to give Soviet, and later Russian, air defense commanders hours of warning rather than minutes. That entire structure assumed a particular kind of adversary, one flying manned aircraft or launching missiles from known, fixed, distant locations. It did not seriously anticipate cheap, numerous long-endurance drones capable of being launched from improvised positions much closer to their targets, absorbing losses that would once have been considered prohibitive, and simply being replaced by the 1,000 more coming behind them. That mismatch between a defense architecture built for one kind of war and the actual character of the war Russia now finds itself fighting is really the deeper story underneath the satellite images. Ukraine's drone campaign did not need to defeat the Bastion strategy in a single dramatic engagement. It only needed to make that strategy expensive to maintain everywhere at once, across a country that spans 11 time zones, with a domestic missile industry that, however large, was never designed to replace hundreds of interceptor missiles and dozens of battalions worth of launcher vehicles at the pace modern attritional warfare demands. Every strike on a refinery, every strike on a depot, every strike on a battery in occupied Crimea is in that sense a withdrawal from the same finite account. Severodvinsk is simply one of the places where that account finally ran visibly dry. There is also a broader signal here for anyone watching Russian military posture from outside the war itself, particularly in the Nordic and Baltic states, and within NATO more generally. For years, Western defense planning around the High North operated on the assumption that Russia's Arctic military infrastructure, its submarine bases, its air defense network, its early warning systems, represented a uniquely hardened, uniquely prioritized part of the Russian military, effectively cordoned off from whatever pressures might affect the rest of the country. That assumption is now visibly harder to sustain. If Russia is willing to accept a materially weaker air defense posture around its only nuclear submarine construction yard, a facility with direct bearing on its long-term strategic deterrent, in order to free up systems for a conventional war several thousand kilometers away, that tells NATO planners something important about how Moscow is currently weighing risk. It suggests a Russian defense establishment operating in crisis management mode, rather than long-term strategic planning mode, making decisions driven by this month's most urgent threat, rather than this decade's most consequential one. Analysts who study the region have been fairly direct in reading this as evidence that Moscow, at least for now, does not believe an attack on its Arctic infrastructure is imminent. That is itself a kind of intelligence, a window into how Russian planners currently rank the likelihood of various threats against each other, even if it says nothing certain about how that calculation might change. It is worth noting, too, that this pattern of quiet redeployment carries its own risks for Russia beyond the immediate question of Severodvinsk's vulnerability. A defense network that has been repeatedly raided for spare battalions to plug urgent gaps elsewhere becomes progressively harder to reconstitute later, even if the political will and the budget eventually exist to do so. Trained air defense crews, like the one Lieutenant Colonel Spiridonov commanded, are not interchangeable with newly conscripted personnel in the way that equipment sometimes can be swapped between units. Radar systems calibrated to specific coastal and Arctic conditions, sited on particular hills and islands for particular geometric reasons, tied to the terrain and the expected threat axis, cannot simply be dropped back into place by moving a truck back to where it used to sit. Rebuilding what has been dismantled at Yagri Island and Mironova Gora, if Moscow ever decides that rebuilding is necessary, would likely take years, not months, and would compete for resources against whatever crisis is consuming Russian air defense assets at that future moment. In that sense, every battalion pulled south is not simply relocated. It represents a small, cumulative erosion of a capability that took generations to build, and that Russia's wartime economy may simply not have the spare capacity to replace in kind. None of this guarantees that Severodvinsk will ever actually be struck, and nothing in the available evidence suggests Ukraine currently intends to attempt it. The shipyards remain standing, fully operational, still building and repairing the submarines that anchor a significant part of Russia's long-term strategic posture. What has changed is not the target. It is the cost of reaching it, at least on paper, and the fact that this cost fell without Ukraine ever having to spend a single asset to lower it. That, more than any individual empty hardstand or vacant radar pad, is the real substance of this story. A demonstration of how a sustained, geographically dispersed campaign of pressure can reshape an adversary's defensive posture in places the campaign itself never physically reaches, simply by making everywhere else expensive enough that something, somewhere, eventually has to be left exposed. For decades, the calculation in Severodvinsk was simple and unchanging. The shipyards are irreplaceable, therefore they will always be defended. That calculation has not been formally abandoned. It has just, for now, quietly